Hey, Stephen, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks very much. So there's lots going on in the Middle East these days. We had Tunisia's election, of course, the end of Gaddafi, and we are fully into Egypt's extended political season, which is the ostensible purpose of our conversation today.
It's going to be incredible. The parliamentary elections alone, the first actual date of voting is November 28th, and they're not going to be over until March.
It's truly an extraordinary and long period of time. I keep getting asked, well, what do I make of the elections? What do I think the process is going to be like? And I think that, people need to be mindful of the fact that, although Mubarak fell last February, and we're actually coming up on, 10 months, 11 months since then, that actually, from my perspective, a lot more could have been done to prepare for these elections, even though they've now been delayed. And I would expect that the process is going to be anything but smooth. I mean, the process is never smooth under Mubarak and his Ministry of Interior, and there's always been, these elections have been marked by violence and have been contested in a variety of ways. And I would expect that despite the Tunisian example of yesterday, October 23rd, which was very, very good, and despite the fact that I think that there are a lot of, fair-minded Egyptians who want to provide an example that they can do the same thing, I think there's going to be problems. What say you?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that's an aspect of these parliamentary elections in Egypt that people aren't talking about enough, which is the potential for violence. As you noted, there has been violence in Egyptian parliamentary elections in the past.
That's right.
And this very protracted schedule, where you're going to have 3 different rounds for each of the lower house of parliament and the upper house of parliament.
It just provides opportunity for this kind of thing.
Well, okay, so you're having 6 election days instead of 1 election day. So those are, 6 times at least as many opportunities for violence.
Of course, we should point out, Michelle, that we do have the Egyptian opposition to thank for that, because they're the ones who had insisted that the Egyptian judiciary supervise elections. And there aren't enough of them.
Yeah, the problem is, unfortunately, that there has never been a really independent electoral commission in Egypt, and nor did that seem to be a possibility in this setup. So the only thing that Egyptians feel some level of confidence in is their judges. This is unique to Egypt, this model of using judges to supervise elections directly. But at the moment, it's the only thing that Egyptians are comfortable with. And there just aren't enough judges to go around. Now, I have to say, if the military council had agreed to hold the elections purely on proportional representation and not to have the 1/3 of the seats set aside for individual candidates, they would not have had to have the runoffs. So then you would have, had fewer election days. Frankly, you could have, you wouldn't have had to have the runoffs for each one. So.
Well, but you still would have this extended electoral period. The interesting thing is that it's been explained to me is that actually Egypt needs more ballot boxes, but you would actually extend the season further. And again, I think we agree that the potential for violence, the potential for troublemakers to seek to disrupt this, especially over this long period of time, is great. The other thing that people keep asking me is, what is post-elections Egypt going to look like? Which is, obviously it's very hard to predict. What I've been saying is, and if you don't mind, let me plug The Struggle for Egypt. Where's my camera? The Struggle for Egypt. Hello, there it is. My new book on Egypt. And what I've been saying is that what we really need to look at are kind of past patterns of Egyptian politics. There's really no way of predicting. Obviously, no one predicted that the uprising of January 25th would bring down Mubarak. Nobody has a crystal ball who can say exactly what is going to happen in after these elections. But it strikes me that there's some continuity between what might unfold in the coming months, and not what happened in the Mubarak or Sadat or even Nasser years, but even before that. The last time that Egypt had arguably a freer political system with a freer political environment and a somewhat functioning parliament. And it seems to me that we're going to see a very strong Islamist presence in the parliament. We're going to see strong leftist tendencies in the parliament. You'll see some of these historic parties like the Wafd, maybe the Free Egyptian Party, that's the party that's been bankrolled by Naguib Sawiris, that wants to take seats away from the Wafd. And then a whole smattering of independents. And of course, appended to some of these things are NDP remnants. But what it will look like is kind of this uncertain, unstable political environment in which no one political party or group can impose their will over the others. Now, that in one sense that may be a good thing, in another sense it may be a bad thing in that it will allow, for example, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to manipulate this parliament. Or it's bad in the sense that you will have, as I said, a fair amount of uncertainty and instability in the parliament. So whatever it is, I think it's going to be a mess, and of course the struggle for Egypt will continue.
Well, the question that I keep getting is, who's going to win in the elections? And I think it's impossible to forecast that right now, because in past elections you had something like 3 or 4 million Egyptians voting, and then of course rigged results, so you don't even know exactly how they voted. In this election, I've heard forecasts anywhere from 15 to over 30 million Egyptians voting.
So you're going to have 5. I don't know how they're going to manage it.
Yeah, well, that goes back to the violence question we were talking about a few minutes ago. But also, if you have all these Egyptians who've never voted before suddenly voting, I don't know how in the world you predict how they're going to vote. And polling data, which there is polling data out there, it's notoriously unreliable guide to how people all over the world to how people are going to actually vote. But I mean, the only things I think we can count on to give us some indications of what the post-elections political landscape look like are the electoral system itself, which will tell you some things about what the possibilities are, and then the parameters that some of the main political players are putting on themselves. I mean, for example, the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood's party, the Freedom and Justice Party, is not contesting all the seats.
It's a good point.
Means that it's very unlikely you're going to have an Islamist. You're certainly not going to have a Brotherhood majority. Right. And you're probably not going to have an Islamist majority, but you might very well have an Islamist plurality within the parliament.
Well, the number that people keep throwing around is 30-35%. I don't know where that number came from. It just seems to be a number that people feel.
Well, I think where it comes from is that that's what the Brotherhood has said. That it's. I mean, at least the people from the Brotherhood with whom I've met have said that's their goal.
They say that that's what they're aiming for.
Right.
We know that they will achieve it. I mean, we know from the previous election that they won the seats that they contested. This is a very different political environment. But I agree. I think we're going to see this Islamist plurality. But I have a challenge for you. Can you make heads or tails of this electoral law?
Well, look, they
tell me. I don't understand it.
They have the most complicated electoral law. I mean, that they could possibly have. And this is one of the scary things going into this election is they've chosen, and we've already said they have this unique system of judicial supervision of elections that, really nobody knows how to do it well. And then on top of that, they've chosen an extraordinarily complicated model. You've got 2 houses of parliament with, 2/3 party list seats, 1/3 individual seats, but then on top of that, you've got, certain number of the seats have to go to farmers and workers, and the way that it's not even completely clear to me how the party list seats are going to be run, because you've got a lot of small parties gathering together into various lists.
Right.
And how those can be listed on the ballot, and how voters are supposed to know.
They're going to have to negotiate that amongst themselves if they're going to join this list. But again,
it's not only that. I mean, there's some recent things in the press. I mean, they're just finalizing the lists now about whether, for example, the Democratic Alliance, the Tahaluf Demokrati, can be listed that way on the ballot, or does it have to be listed by the name of the leading party, which is the Freedom and Justice Party, the Muslim Brotherhood Party. So. This is going to be extremely confusing for voters, and I think that some of the parties that have maybe have good name recognition. For example, the Weft Party, right, which goes back to the 1920s. And even though it hasn't done a lot for Egypt in a long time, at least people know the name. They're thinking that they're going to sort of...
just going to win just based on the fact that...
Well, they're not going to necessarily win. I mean, they're going to
win seats.
Win seats, just based on the fact that when people look at that ballot, that's going to be the only name they recognize.
Well, there's also, kind of retread, the Tahaluf Islami, which was something that was run in the late 1980s as well, a coalition of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Weft, not the Weft, the Labour Party and another smaller party. I think we're essentially on the same page that this is likely not to be the easiest election, with both the kind of the rules that are governing it, and then of course how it will unfold.
But let me ask you a question about what's going to happen after the elections, because I think this is a really important issue. As you know, as of now, the military council is resisting scheduling the presidential election. All the major parties in Egypt now, the presidential candidates and the political parties, even including the Brotherhood, are pressing now for setting a date for the presidential election to be held maybe a couple of months after the parliamentary elections are completed. The Supreme Military Council, though, seems to still favor a model of putting it off until after the writing of a constitution. That's and how long that's going to take is, we can discuss that. That's a very controversial issue, whether that's something that's going to take 2 months or 2 years. Okay, my concern is what's going to happen with the cabinet. Egypt has had technocratic cabinets for some time, and but now some of the political forces, particularly the Brotherhood in Egypt, are trying to create the expectation, and I found this was widespread when I was in Egypt just about a week ago, that the military, which will continue to hold executive authority until there is a presidential election, should appoint a political cabinet, a cabinet that reflects the forces in the parliament after the parliamentary elections. That and that surely the party that holds a plurality in the parliament, which we all know most likely, if it's anyone, would be the Freedom and Justice Party, the Muslim Brotherhood Party, should be given the right to form a cabinet. They're trying to push things in the direction of a parliamentary system even before the Constitution is rewritten. And I want to ask you if you agree with me that this is one argument why the military should in fact agree to hold the presidential election, give a date certain for the presidential election, and hold it even if the Constitution is not rewritten by then, because otherwise they're going to be pushed in this direction of appointing a political cabinet as opposed to a technocratic one.
Well, let me just say as a blanket statement, I think that the military has handled the timing of this incredibly poorly. I mean, there's not much that they've handled well since Mubarak fell. And I think that, at least based on what I hear from them and what I'm reading between the tea leaves, is that the idea of holding the presidential election in, let's say, the first quarter of 2013, for example, after the Constitution is written, is a way, from their perspective, of ensuring, there's a greater chance that they would ensure the stability of the country that way, as opposed to doing things.
But do you agree that that's
true?
I don't
think that that's the case at all.
It doesn't seem to me that their management of the country is creating a lot of stability.
No, not at all. I mean, I think that they clearly don't have a perfect theory of politics, but they seem to think that this is what is going to be something that will, we get through elections, we have this constitution writing process, and that somehow that will happen relatively quickly. I think we agree. We both have our doubts that that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to be 6 months, 2 years, 2.5. I think it could be prolonged, actually, the process of writing the Constitution, which...
I actually think it's a problem if they try to rush through it in a few months.
Agreed. I think
that's a bigger problem than having it take 2 years.
I think it's both a problem if it's rushed and a problem if it takes a longer period of time, because a longer period of time gives an excuse for the military to continue to retain that executive power in a longer.
No. Well, wait, but not necessarily. I mean, if the parliament and president are elected, then technically the military goes back to its parents. Now we know they're going to have influence.
Well, technically,
but that doesn't matter. I mean, But if they prolong the period of before there's a presidential
that's what I'm
election,
talking about.
then they continue.
That's precisely what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That if they prolong the period, then if they wait for a constitution to be written before there's a presidential election, we could be waiting a very long time before there is actually a presidential election. So I think that either way, you have a potentially destabilizing aspects. It seems to me that you would want to have the presidential election sooner rather than later if the military is going to fully step out of the political system. Nobody thinks that they're not going to have influence. In fact, there will be more autonomous and probably more influential in a post-Mubarak Egypt than they were under Mubarak. But nevertheless, I agree that the way this process is set up is problematic. And I think that you're right. I think that what the Brotherhood is trying to do, or it seems what they're trying to do, is to move this in the direction of a parliamentary system. I wonder, however, if that is not where people want this to go anyway, towards a purely parliamentary system, having had this experience over the course of the last 60 years with presidents with an extraordinary amount of power. Now, it may not necessarily be the best system for Egyptians, but you can understand the inclination for Egypt to move towards, for Egyptians to want to move towards a parliamentary system. And in fact, the data suggests that parliamentary systems are more stable anyway. But I understand what you're saying, that there is this kind of sneaking suspicion that they're trying to...
Wait. Why do you say that data suggests that parliamentary systems are more stable? More stable in what way?
In terms of stable democratic systems rather than presidential systems where presidents accumulate power and undermine democratic institutions.
Parliamentary systems have the reputation for being unstable in the sense that they hold frequent elections,
right, exactly. But I'm talking about
governments fall.
That's right. But I'm talking about in the ability to undermine democratic institutions. You'd rather have a purely parliamentary system than a presidential system.
Right, but let me ask you a question now. Where should the United States stand?
Well, that was my question for you.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll tell you.
All right, and then I'll tell you what I think.
I'm very troubled at the hints that the Egyptian military has been putting out in the press. They're trial balloons about the role that they would like to see for themselves in the future. Perhaps something, what I'm concerned about is that they want to, formalize and put in writing somehow in the Constitution, for example, or there's been discussion of it in the super constitutional document, something that would give them an implicit right to intervene in politics and that will give them a formalized pass from civilian oversight, whether it's parliamentary oversight of the budget, presidential appointment of the senior members of the military, the possibility of some kind of very empowered National Security Council in which the elected president just becomes one of several members, the other members being unelected military officers.
You're essentially describing Turkey in the 1980s and 1990s.
Right. And so now my point of view is that the United States really needs to oppose this. We can talk about how the United States should do this, how publicly, privately. There are various tactics. But I think this would be a huge mistake if the United States is seen as complicit with this kind of an arrangement. And having just come from Egypt, most of the people that I talked to seem to feel that that was where things were going, that the United States would lose its nerve, especially if the Brotherhood does well in elections, and would be, happy to see this kind of a larger military role, even larger than they had under Mubarak, and more formalized. I mean, written into the Constitution and into laws. From my point of view, if Egypt's ever going to become a democracy, eventually there has to be civilian oversight of the military.
Right, of course.
That doesn't mean you're going to have it this year or next year, but you have to move in that direction gradually. And if the United States is, complicit or doesn't care or looks the other way or, encourages or whatever, a more formalized, legally formalized role for the military, I think that just means we are complicit in creating large new obstacles that will have to be overcome if Egypt is ever going to make it to democracy.
I think overall I agree with what you're saying. I think there's a sense, And I don't know for sure. Again, I'm kind of reading tea leaves here that within the administration there are divisions. There are people who say, hey, look, it's not perfect if the military were to have a role, but it's better than what it could be. And in fact, we are nervous about what the outcome would be in a more democratic and open and fairer, less rigged political order. And so we're perfectly willing to live with the kind of outsized role of the military. And then there are others, I think, within the Obama administration whose views track very closely with what you just articulated, Michele, which is that we're just recreating a problem and we are help enabling obstacles to a more democratic Egypt. And I certainly would agree that, in fact, if the military were able to pull off something akin or similar to what the Turkish military was able to do through the 1982 constitution in Turkey, we would absolutely be helping them throw up obstacles to a democratic transition in Turkey. All that said, I somewhat doubtful, not that they intend to do it. I'm not quite sure what the officers have in mind, but I'm not sure that they can do it. I think there's three missing ingredients in the Turkish model the three ingredients in the Turkish model that are not necessarily present or not present enough in Egypt to make it really possible. One is you need to have kind of broad elite support in order for the military to have this role. There's never been a military intervention or whether a coup or something else that hasn't had some sense of elite support. I just don't see that kind of elite support happening in Egypt. I know that, for example, this idea of an autonomous sphere for the military has been discussed by people like Judge Histam Bastawisi, even El Baradei mentioned it, a number of others. But broadly speaking, you don't have a kind of political class that is clamoring for this. The second thing is this kind of role really presupposes the military's almost direct role, or that the military's agents itself write the Constitution and write these provisions into the Constitution. I have no doubt that there are agents of the military out there working, but after what we're hoping will be a free and fair election, it just seems hard that a new parliament that's going to select this committee to write the Constitution, that the military is going to have enough people there to impose their will on it.
But wait a minute. Let me just stop you there, because my understanding is there are already a couple of drafts out there of the Constitution. That's one reason why the military says, hey, don't worry, this whole Constitution thing, couple of months. Why? Because they've already got the draft.
Well, I'm not sure that they have it in the can. Even if they do, this is supposedly something that is going to happen more in the open after elections. It's entirely possible that whatever draft Tantawi has in his back pocket is ultimately adopted, but at the same time, it seems to me that they're going to have a whole host of political forces, including the Muslim Brotherhood, that is not, even if there is a side deal, that isn't going to be tempted to defy the military on the Constitution. And then the third thing, and I think it's a really important thing, is that in order for the Egyptians to recreate the military, they're going to have to believe in something. And far be it from me to figure out at this point what the Egyptian armed forces believes in as a group, as a kind of collective, as an organization. In Turkey, they were the keepers of the Kemalist flame. That was a kind of ideologically motivating factor for these kinds of interventions. I don't think you can do it.
You don't think the keepers of their own interests
I think they have
strong enough motivation?
It is. The point is that it's their particular parochial interests that aren't shared by a broader class of people. That's what I'm saying, is that you need to have a kind of broader class of broader elite support. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm just saying I think it's going to be a lot harder to do it.
Keeping the Brotherhood at bay? Do you think there will be a large enough, depending on, let's say the Brotherhood gets that 30 or 40% of the seats that people are talking about. Do you think there'd be, you've got all the sort of old elites that supported the NDP, their big families and the business interests and so forth. Well, won't they all go running to the military for protection and say, oh, please save us from the Brotherhood?
I think it's entirely possible. I think it's likely, in fact, that they will go to the Brotherhood. Go to the military and say, save us from the Brotherhood. The question is what kind of deal that the military makes with the Brotherhood, if they make a deal at all. It strikes me that there is a lot more that's going on there in the relationship between the military and the Brotherhood than just one of them facing off against each other. I think ultimately they are competitors in this environment. I think ultimately that is the case. But at the same time, I don't think the military has much use for these business elites who were kind of either corrupt themselves or on the kind of fringes of an NDP that the military, at least publicly in the way it postures, that they manifestly disapproved of.
Well, so, and who had, were emerging as competitors to the military.
Exactly.
Whether economically, politically, etc.
So I think
they seem to have been very happy to eliminate a lot of those people.
Exactly.
But still, there are other people. I mean, those people who were kind of the Gamal Mubarak cronies are not the only people in Egypt with money.
I agree, but I do think that this is a class that has generally been tainted. I think the point is, and I don't think we disagree on this, is that what we can expect from the military, whether they're trying to recreate, Istanbul on the Nile or not, is that they are going to look to make kind of tactical political deals with whichever group is going to advance their particular interest at that moment. And it could be the Brotherhood, it could be these business classes, it could be someone else. But the fact of the matter is that the military...
see how the old NDP people do in the parliament.
Absolutely.
And if they're parliamentary elections, and if they're useful, then
it strikes me that the military wants three things. It wants stability, it wants to maintain its economic interests, and it wants to continue to be that source of legitimacy for the Egyptian state. And they'll make deals with whoever it is who can help them ensure that in whatever guise, whether it's as I said, Istanbul or the Nile or something else. The problem, as I see it, is that in particular this question of continuing to be the expression or repository of the state's legitimacy is very much contested. You have revolutionary groups that obviously think very differently. You have Islamists who think very differently about where the legitimacy of the state and the sources of power and authenticity and legitimacy in the state should reside. And I think that this is a very important fight. Where, just to bring it back to where we started, which is with the role of the United States, I think that there is some natural inclination to kind of look at this extraordinarily complex situation and say, God, whoever gets control of this, that should be okay with us, and better it be the military than someone else. Well, as you quite rightly pointed out, this would throw up obstacles to a transition to democracy. Now, the question for you is, how do we? So, who's the messenger? Who goes to Tantawi? Who goes to the scouts?
Okay, but let me clarify something. When I asked you sort of what do you think about this? What should the United States do? You accurately described, I think, different points of view inside the U.S. administration. But what do you think the United States should do?
Oh no,
should the United States have a position on whether we're cool with
absolutely. No. We should have a position.
Formalized role.
No, we
for
should.
The military?
We should absolutely have a position because, as I've been saying from the very beginning, we should stick to those kinds of first principles about democracy, tolerance, nonviolence, equal application of laws, and civilian control of the military. These are the kind of hallmarks and building blocks of democracy, and we should take the military by its own words, saying that it is. When they were here in July, they kept talking about preparing the grounds for Egypt's democratic future. And we should absolutely hold them to account on these issues. In Turkey, democratic change happened not because of the military, but despite the military. And I think that's an important lesson to learn. If people are all infused with this idea about Turkey as a model and so on and so forth, I think we should be very clear to Tantawi and the other generals that we don't look upon this kind of autonomous role that we suspect they may be trying to carve out as the proper trajectory for Egyptian politics.
All right. So then, surprisingly, we agree on what the U.S. should be doing. So now the question is, how do we do it?
Right.
Right.
And so
what's
this may be where we disagree.
What's the model? Okay. So I mean, of course, there are a series of private discussions. I mean, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense were there recently, the head of CENTCOM. I mean, there have been visits and telephone calls, and then also meetings here in Washington with visiting military delegations. And, I think what's interesting about those kind of meetings that if you serve in government, you find out is that the discussions are often a lot less frank than people who are outside of government might be expecting them to be.
Right.
So what you just said, Stephen, that the United States, shouldn't. Is not in favor of the military having this kind of a role going forward. It sounds really sensible. My experience with U.S. officials is that they would have a really hard time saying something like that in a meeting to
with Tontai.
The Minister of Defense in Egypt or something like that. So one of the things is that I think the United States has to show through its treatment of specific incidents as they arise where we stand on these issues. And that goes for private conversations and to some extent in public statements as well. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Right now, in fact, today, in the Egyptian media, there was a statement by some statements by the Minister of International Cooperation.
You mean the Minister of International Non-Cooperation?
Right. Who is talking about, once again, she's on American funding for NGOs for democracy assistance, and claiming that the United States is becoming, embroiled in Egyptian politics, and this kind of funding isn't done anywhere else in the world, and it's breaking the law, and she's out there
the same stuff we've been hearing for years, actually.
Yeah, exactly, and so I mean, U.S. officials have been really very, very silent on this.
Right.
They're not out there, creating the counter narrative and saying, wait a minute, excuse me. Contrary to what the minister says, this is exactly the kind of democracy assistance that is given all over the world. Right. And Egypt is now a country that claims to be democratizing, where this kind of assistance should be welcome. And that it's not intervention in politics. It's assistance to development of the processes of politics, and not, it's not like we're pumping money into one party or another. But I don't find that U.S. officials are doing this.
Right.
I don't find they're defending the U.S. point of view. They seem to be very, very, very quiet. To me, the impression I get from U.S. officials is that they're kind of confused. They're caught on the back foot. They're not quite sure how the U.S. should or can even articulate its point of view, let alone defend the position that it's taking and the activities that it's undertaking.
Well, not being a U.S. official, and unlike you, having never served in government before, I have to say that I agree with you in the sense that it's unclear to anybody exactly what our policy is. I think we haven't really quite figured it out, and I think that as we were discussing before, I think certain people have equities in one direction and others in another. One is, we should use all of the tools available to us to promote democratic change, including this funding of NGOs issues, and others who say, well, it's not perfect, it's never going to be perfect, and if the military is going to keep this place from exploding, well, then that's okay with us too. And I think that is still being worked out and I guess fought over in the in the interagency process and among different all these different people with different perspectives on it. My sense is that, I mean, of course, you're absolutely right. These are the kinds of things that we do all over the world, and so on and so forth. But it seems that the Egyptian government under Tantawi and under Mubarak for that period was going to oppose this type of situation in which we fund NGOs and so on and so forth for democracy promotion. It strikes me that no matter what it is that we do on that end, we are going to be in for trouble. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. What I think that is an effective thing to do, and I take your point because you've been in those meetings that I have not been in, where the senior U.S. officials are talking to senior Egyptian officials, and it's more scripted and stunted and not as frank as they may say when they come out of the meeting and say we had frank discussions. I think that we should publicly air for these kinds of things. I think that the principals should say things. I think the Secretary of State in Cairo should say, we support and these kind of basic first-order principles about democracy and tolerance and equal application of the law, and the military becoming what is the word I'm looking for?
Under civilian control.
Under civilian control. I was looking for a better word, but placed under civilian control. These are all the hallmarks of democracy.
Neutralized? Neutered, maybe? I don't know. What was the word you were looking for?
No, it wasn't. That wasn't the word that I was looking for. But if we want to use neutralized and neutered, that's perfectly fine too. I guess though the imagery for me is a little too much to take. So, but I think the point is that regardless of whether anybody takes off their shoe and bangs it on the table, we're going to create this situation with Faiza Abu-Naga, the Minister of International Cooperation. After all, that's what she's there for, to delegitimize these things. And it strikes me that what we do then is we just further kind of poison the atmosphere if we are taking her on point by point, rather than raising it a level in which we talk about principles. And these are principles that I honestly believe that Egyptians are responding to, and the primary reason why they rose up in late January and February. We've heard a lot about economic grievances and so on and so forth, but I do think that these ideas about freedom and democracy and accountability and rooting out corruption and all these kinds of things are important, and I think that they should be raised, and I think they should be raised publicly if U.S. officials can't bring it to themselves to raise these issues directly and forthrightly with those people who are in Egypt.
I agree with you.
Where I think is a little bit, and I know we disagree here, a little bit problematic is that we're just creating more and more friction by going back to this NGO thing. They're never going to accept it. We should just ignore this kind of thing from Faiza Abu-Naga. As I said, that's why she's there.
Yeah, but wait a minute. Let me stop you.
Let
me tell you why it's getting hard to ignore. You can ignore statements that she's making, although I do think the statements do damage because she's out there. And I'm talking here about the Military Council and some members of the cabinet, particularly Minister Abu-Naga. What they're trying to do is drive a wedge between NGOs and movements like the April 6th youth movement and so forth and the Egyptian public. I'm convinced this is what it's about. They never took these guys seriously, and then they found out in this revolution in January that these people could create real trouble.
Right.
And so now they want to speaking of neutralize, they want to neutralize them. And how do they do that? They try to discredit them in the eyes of the public. And they're pulling out the oldest trick in the book. You're a foreign agent. Therefore, that discredits you. So that's what they're up to here. And the fact that, she's going out, and it's unbelievable. I mean, it's like 3 times a week. She's got an interview with the Egyptian media talking about this. And, she's just hammering away day after day at the idea that the United States is carrying out illegal activities, that it's funding. Now, I hope that Egyptians just see through that. And I'm sure there are many who do. But I think there are many who, frankly, are just ignorant about what goes on in the rest of the world and the fact that the kind of democracy promotion activities that the United States does in Egypt are done all over the world. But it's also becoming hard to ignore because now they're going after NGOs. I don't know if you're aware, but there have been several incidents with Freedom House just in the past couple of weeks where it's all the old tricks. Do you remember, you've seen this done 100 times before, where an NGO has an activity planned at a public venue, and they arrive for the activity, and suddenly they're told, I'm so sorry, your activity has been canceled because of...
It actually happened to me once,
a plumbing problem, or the double booking, whatever. This has started happening again. Harassment of NGO people has started happening again. All the old state security, internal security tricks are coming out again. Why is this happening? Now, you're saying, we're always going to have these problems. I'm not sure we're always going to have these problems. I think, I don't think this is coming from the Egyptian public. I think this is coming from the Military Council. And, I think that they are worried about these NGOs, and they're worried about American support for these NGOs. And they're trying to, and, we're going to have these problems at least as long as they're in control.
I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, nobody's condoning the activity. I certainly, and everything that, I've said and written since has suggested that I believe that the military is part of a kind of stealthy counter-revolution that is seeking to undermine these things. What I think, though, perhaps I give more credit to, broadly speaking, the public and kind of seeing through these things as, this is what happened under the previous regime and so on and so forth. But the other thing is, I see it in less. I mean, yes, of course, I think you're right. I think they are trying in some ways to drive a wedge between these groups that have instigated the uprising, and that it's part of this competing legitimacies that I talked about not too long ago. But I see it more as developing a dossier against the United States in an effort to kind of justify some of the things that they are doing domestically, and I think ultimately to do the kinds of things that they're ultimately going to be forced to do in a more open political environment on the foreign policy front. But you're not going to get an argument from me that these kinds of things that are happening are an effort to undermine and delegitimize a group of people that have suddenly become extraordinarily important competitors to the military in terms of who holds legitimacy? What are the sources of power in this system? The question is that how does the United States, how do we address this in the most effective kind of manner? I think that what you're suggesting in terms of this, a more aggressive public posture on these issues in particular, only seems to fuel the kinds of things that Faiza Abu Naga says. So let's say we come out and said, and publicly made a statement or, tried to change the narrative, I can see her getting back on state television and say, you see, everything that I've been telling you for the last months is actually true. Look at what Washington said. That's why I'm suggesting that perhaps we rise above this. Although I take your point 100%. This is it's extraordinarily difficult. I'm just not sure how far we are going to be able to advance the interests of those who we ostensibly want to help by taking her on directly, because I think it just motivates them to go back on Egyptian television wherever.
I would be content with either one of these things, either U.S. officials speaking out clearly on the level of principle or taking on some of these specific accusations. To me, we don't have to get into the weeds on this, but the specific accusation that the United States is carrying out activities in Egypt that are illegal and that we don't do anywhere else in the world.
Agreed.
I can't believe we're leaving that unaddressed.
That's absolutely. I agree.
And I think it should be taken on at a very high level. So that's one thing. We don't have to get into the fine points of Egyptian law and so forth.
Right.
But I don't see U.S. officials doing either one of these things. I mean, I
have a good idea. We know some U.S. officials. We'll send this video to them and we'll ask them to pay.
I'm sure this is just going to absolutely turn them around. But no, I'll tell you something. And I know you don't think this, Stephen, but I am concerned that there are still people in the U.S. government that are buying the narrative that I think the current military leadership is selling here, which is that, we really were forced to crack down on NGOs in Egypt because there's public opposition. There's public opposition to foreign funding, and the United States doesn't have a very good reputation, and there's
This is the same. This sounds, it's like eerily familiar to the Mubarak
era.
We created the Higher Election Commission because the judges had become politicized.
Absolutely. And we're just responding to public criticism, which in fact, I said, I was discussing this with some U.S. officials recently. I said, look, just go back. If you do your research and you go back, you will see there was zero public criticism of democracy programs or U.S. funding or anything like that after the revolution until the SCAF and Minister Abu Naga went out there and started planting these ideas that the U.S. is trying to intervene in. I mean, they created this. It didn't come from the public, and they're responding to it. But a lot of times, frankly, U.S. officials are not. They're not watching carefully enough to make those kind of distinctions.
Do you think this now? We can get ourselves wrapped around an axle on this for hours here. But do you also see this? And I tend to see it this way. I see this as also a function, not that Faisal Banaga was ever a friend of the United States or anything like that, or that even the military, I mean, I think that the military was interested in extracting resources, but I do see also this as part of a kind of broader effort, a broader kind of responding to new kinds of domestic political pressures. These are, after all, in particular the military, these are guys who were identified with, even though they may not have been fans of the United States, but identified with the United States because of the U.S. assistance program, that in the same way that the military rejected the easiest IMF program in the history of IMF programs, that part of building this dossier is a way of establishing as much daylight as possible between themselves and a previous era in which they were entirely complicit, in order to make it more palatable for them to play a role in the new deal, so that they are as good nationalists, just like everybody else who rose up.
Stephen, I think I see it a little bit differently. What I think is that
that's why I asked, because I knew you saw it.
These kind of positions that the military is taking, this kind of super nationalist, xenophobic, relatively close to the outside world. This is the way that they wish things would have been run anyway in Egypt, and if they had their way, would have been run. All the kind of globalization and active engagement with international financial institutions and allowing even a limited, say, opening up of the media and some limited opening up of civil society. This is all the Gamal Mubarak plan that I think they probably never approved of.
Right.
And so now they're reverting to form here.
Right. Look, let's be clear. Tantawi is like Mubarak was 30 years ago. So this isn't, I agree with you, this isn't someone who is engaged in the global stage and connected to the world and so on and so forth. But I see it as a kind of more basic imperative. Like I said, responding to new kind of political incentives and pressures that is, that the military is kind of preparing the way to diverge because they're, in essence, forced to, because I think public opinion doesn't really carry the same kind of, it won't carry the U.S.-Egypt relationship in a way that was done in the last 30 years.
This is a perfect bridge to the other subject that I really wanted to bring up with you, which is the whole subject of this triangular relationship. Egypt, Israel, and the United States. I mean, let's face it, Israel is right in the middle here. The whole, from the U.S. point of view, and certainly you hear this very, very clearly when you're in the U.S. Congress, the whole rationale for the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, the assistance relationship, the military assistance, the economic assistance, it was all built on Egypt's peace treaty with Israel and role in kind of keeping the region stable and so forth. And I think, there's a real problem with that now. I hear, from Egyptians all the time, yes, we want a relationship with the United States, but we don't want it to be all about Israel. And, people were very upset when they heard about the language that came out of both the House and the Senate about conditioning aid to Egypt. The language that came out of the House basically conditioned the aid solely on the preservation of the peace treaty with Israel. The Senate had that, and then also had things about Egypt holding free elections and respecting human rights and so forth.
But at base, it was about maintaining the status quo.
And that's all that got through in the Egyptian media. All that people knew about it was that the U.S. Congress wanted to condition aid on the maintenance of the peace treaty with Israel. And frankly, I don't really see anybody in Egypt, or let's say, no, I won't say anybody. I don't see any of the major players wanting to abrogate the peace treaty with Israel. And Egypt has benefited from this triangular relationship, right? I mean, that's why they got all that aid. And certainly, the Egyptian embassy here in Washington played that year after year, that, don't forget the peace treaty, don't forget the role that Egypt plays in creating a stable atmosphere for Israel. So Egypt has been benefiting at that, but we've now reached a situation where it's very much resented in Egypt. And they're, for example,
As you're saying this, I'm flipping through my book in page 230, 244, the trilateral logic of bilateral relations, and we absolutely agree here that certainly Egyptian leadership benefited over the course of 30 years. The United States benefited, the Israelis benefited, but that this trilateral relationship is deeply resented by many Egyptians. I agree. I don't think that people want to abrogate the treaty. I do think, though, that in many ways and in many quarters, the idea that the treaty was always and forever a good thing for the Egyptians is false. I think that they see it as having rendered Egypt a secondary or second-rate power. If you just kind of think about the things that Israel, in fact, they see it as a way in which it freed both Israel and the United States to pursue their interests in the Middle East unencumbered. And you can kind of count the number of things that the Israelis have done since the peace treaty that Egyptians are opposed to, whether it's settlement building on a large scale, in 2 invasions of Lebanon, a bombing of Iraq, and you can go on and on and on and on and on. And the Egyptians were left to demarche Israeli diplomats or complain at the UN. This was not the Egypt that Egyptians
and left
wanted.
To try to make sure that the Arab League never went very far and criticize.
Right, exactly.
Not that, frankly, I thought the Arab League could have done a lot, but it certainly was Mubarak's job over the years to make sure that the Arab League didn't get too energized about these things.
That's right. That's right. And I think that is, this uprising, this revolution wasn't about the strategic alignment with the United States or Israel, but I do think it's part of this thing about pride
about accountability,
and empowerment Agreed. And I think that's why I think things are, they're not, this isn't the end of the world. The sky isn't going to fall, but I do think things are likely to change in some discrete ways. The evolving relationship with Hamas, for example, the noise about establishing diplomatic ties with Iran. Whether these things actually happen or not, that I think the narrative, the perception of it, is what is going to be important. And it may, in all likelihood, after elections, if you have freer elections, if you have these different and new groups in new ways represented in the parliament, you're likely to see that public opinion and public sentiment will drive Egyptian foreign policy in certain ways. And the Israelis and the United States need to get used to that. They can't make side deals with authoritarians.
Right. Well, and I think we all saw this with this incident that took place on the Egyptian-Israeli border, where some
I was in Egypt after that.
Right. And where some terrorists infiltrated from Egypt into Israel and killed several people, and then the Israelis were in hot pursuit across the border and several ended up killing several Egyptian border guards. Okay, that was a bad incident, but it got worse because of the handling of it, and I think the Egyptian military also, although the way they handled it with Israel I thought was okay, they handled it very badly in terms of explaining to the Egyptian public what they were doing and why they took the positions they took. And then we saw this, terrible incident in Cairo where they basically, Israeli diplomats had to be evacuated and the embassy was, stormed basically by demonstrators. And so I think you're right. Now, I was glad to see that at the end of the day, Israel actually issued a formal apology. For the killing of the border guards, but it didn't happen right away, and it wasn't handled in such a way as to sort of keep people on the line and patient until it could happen, and so it blew up. And I think unfortunately we're going to see a lot more things like this because I don't know what you think. I don't think the situation in Gaza or the West Bank is particularly stable. I think there's plenty of room for more trouble there, and I think Egyptians are going to react. I'm not sure they're going to take the initiative to take on Israel, but I do think they're going to react more strongly than they have in the past. And by the way, this applies to the United States as well. If the United States ends up vetoing a Palestinian statehood resolution in the UN Security Council, I don't really want to be in the U.S. Embassy in Cairo that day.
Well, I think you're right on this question of being reactive in ways to developments in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or U.S. diplomatic moves, or quite frankly, the situation in Sinai and how the Israelis respond to that. I think that there is going to be, and this is what I'm talking about when I say, the fact that public opinion matters is going to force the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces or whoever is in a position of power in Egypt going forward to respond accordingly. This era in which the Israelis would feel safe that they could crack down on the West Bank and Gaza and only, confront, the most mild of Egyptian responses, I think, is over. Now, I agree that nobody's looking for this confrontation. The Egyptian military is in clearly no shape to challenge the Israelis. But I think on the political front, it is clear that, as I said just a few moments ago, the era of making these kinds of side deals with authoritarians is over in the region. Even if the Egyptian military, as we started out this conversation, prevails in salvaging some sort of authoritarian system in which they are the overall authority, they're still going to be more susceptible to public opinion and public sentiment than they ever were before. And in fact, when the SCAF was here in July, and they gave a number of presentations. They had a private meeting at the Egyptian Defense Office. Then they had something at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I think that they were pretty clear that they were expecting the Israelis to do certain things on the Palestinian front because public opinion would no longer tolerate anything other. So I agree. I think to the extent that there is instability in these places and there is going to be a reaction from Cairo in ways that there haven't been over the course of the last 30 or so years, and it's an entirely new environment. I think, though, there's one positive aspect. I think from the perspective of the United States, I know how many Israelis feel. Many of them are in denial, and they are hoping for a reconstitution of authoritarian. And just if the military would just crack down and give Egyptians the stability they want, everything would be fine. I do think, and that's kind of an Israeli position that I have heard. Obviously, not everybody holds it, but I do think there is a positive here. If Egypt does carve out a more independent foreign policy, particularly on this issue, it may ultimately be a more appropriate interlocutor for the United States and Israel in the region. It would be seen less obviously as a lackey of the United States and by association Israel, and more of the independent regional player that Egyptians like to think of Egypt as.
Well, and I think that I agree. I mean, but it could take a good bit of time to get there. But I think overall the U.S.-Egyptian relationship in time can be a much fuller and more mature relationship. I really thought the Egyptian-U.S. relationship, this whole trilateral basis of the relationship with Israel, that deal had begun to wear very, very thin, and the whole relationship had become sort of ossified and stunted, as the Mubarak regime, continued longer and longer in power. So. Now, a democratic Egypt, we can probably have a better and fuller and more mature U.S. relationship with it in time. I mean, and I've often compared it to the U.S. relationship with a country like Turkey or like Israel. I mean, in these countries, they often elect people who are not our first choices, and some people whom we even view as extremists of one kind or another. Their parliaments take decisions that we don't particularly like at times. And yet those relationships somehow are fuller, richer, and more productive than these very kind of hollow relationships that the United States has had with authoritarian leaders in the Arab world.
But the point is, and I think you make a good one, the word that I've been using is divergence. And perhaps if you wanted to put a positive spin, maybe you want to call it a healthy bit of distance. But we're going to have to be able to tolerate that from the Egyptians. And I'm not necessarily feeling so confident that we, in particular the Congress, is going to be willing to tolerate this kind of distance or this divergence from the United States. You just saw it almost immediately with the Egyptians talking about that they would be interested in establishing diplomatic relations with Iran, and the evolution of Egypt's relationship with Hamas. You saw it in those appropriations bills that there's the tolerance level for an independent Egyptian foreign policy, I think, is pretty low, and it concerns me that it will we will contribute without looking in the over the long term. We will contribute to a deterioration.
Yeah,
of the
I think that's
relationship.
true. And I mean, it's always, I think it's really important at this point to try to help educate members of Congress. And, they're busy. They have a lot of things on their minds. And Egypt, it just, equates to, Israel. Are they maintaining peace with Israel? Good. Then give them what they want or whatever, And so I think people are going to have to start thinking about Egypt in a different way. It's a nation of some, 83 million people. They're a quarter of the Arab world demographically. They're a big power on the African scene, on the Muslim world scene, as well as the Arab scene. And while I think there's every reason to be optimistic that Egypt will maintain its peace with Israel, I don't think that's a lost cause at all. But we're going to have to stop sort of throwing it in their face, every time. I mean, for example, when I was in Egypt recently, I was talking to people about what the receptivity in Egypt would be toward a free trade agreement with the United States and whether that would be something to work toward in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. And one of the first questions that people immediately ask me,
I know exactly what you're
is it going to be tied to Israel? Is that going to be the first
Israel,
thing?
right, exactly. How much Israeli content is going to have
or
to be?
Even if it's not going to be like the qualifying industrial zones that has to have Israeli content, is the first sentence in the agreement going to say that, Egypt has to maintain good relations with Israel?
Right.
And people are highly sensitive to that now, and we need to find a way to show in our dealings with Egypt that, yes, we care about Egypt maintaining peace with Israel and playing a responsible role in the region, but we're not going to be setting it up as the litmus test for every single thing in the relationship.
You're not going to get an argument. That's one thing that we actually 100%, there's no daylight between the two of us. I think that this kind of thing has been corrosive to the U.S.-Egypt relationship in a way that we don't have a bilateral relationship. We are looking at through this other lens, and the quality of the Israel-Egypt relationship is always going to have an effect on the U.S.-Egypt relationship.
Well, you know what? This is part of an overall, I think, updating that is badly needed in the way that Americans see the Middle East, see not only Egypt but other Arab countries. There's a lot of change that has taken place in the region. People in this country are just beginning to wake up to it, and it's going to be a process of education for people to see it in a different way.
I think that's a good way for us to end off, because I think you're right. I think the party, and the party began long before this, but the party in particular that began in 1991 with the first Gulf War that established the United States as the predominant military and political power in the region is now really over. And I think that people have been slow to understand that Arabs, Egyptians, have their own agency, have an ability to calculate their own political interests, and will act accordingly, like everybody else. But we have been this kind of overwhelming actor trying to shape and push and cajole, and that we had willing participants from the Mubaraks of the world, King Abdullah of Jordan, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed VI of Morocco, that helped create a regional order that helped us to achieve whatever our objectives were. That's changing. Even in places where there hasn't been an uprising, I think that leaders are going to be, they're going to ignore public sentiment at their own risk, and that's why I think they're going to be paying much closer attention to it. And I think that that's what's going to happen in the new Egypt. I think we're going to see this divergence
Well, look, I agree with you on public sentiment and the importance of that. We might disagree on the extent of influence that the U.S. has. I personally think that the U.S. has mishandled so many things and frittered away a lot of influence.
What I'm saying. We don't have it.
I think it's still there, and I think we're failing to use it properly right now. But that is a whole other discussion.
You think we have more influence on it?
I think that is a whole other discussion.
That's for the next.
We can disagree about some
That's
other
for
time.
our second installment. That's for our second installment. But I disagree. I think you're giving more credit to that influence. I think we have some, not none. But I think the history, the combination of the history and this super empowered moment means that we are greatly diminished in the minds of many Arabs. But why don't we call it at that?
Let's disagree about that some other time. All
right, we'll disagree about it some other time. I'm holding up my book to the camera again. I'm looking forward to what you think of it, Michelle, and those of you else seeing.
Send me a copy,
hey, they told me to do it. All right, I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.